Imagine walking into a hospital in 1960s Kentucky and seeing a man whose skin was the color of a bruise, not sick, not dying, just blue, bright sapphire blue, his blood purple when exposed to air. The doctors were horrified. They'd never seen anything like it. But here's what made it even more disturbing. This wasn't a rare disease. This wasn't a one-time mutation. This was the result of something far darker, 6 generations of a family secret that the mountains had kept hidden for almost 200 years. Welcome to Troublesome Creek, Kentucky, where they said it was tradition to marry only their own. Before we dive into one of America's darkest family secrets, if you're fascinated by true stories that history tried to bury, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear is 100% documented and far more disturbing than any horror movie. Let's begin. Our story begins in 1820. Martin Fugate, a French orphan with pale skin and striking blue eyes, arrived in the isolated hills of eastern Kentucky. He was searching for a new life in America's untamed wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains in those days weren't just remote, they were practically unreachable. Steep cliffs, dense forests, and winding creeks created natural prisons. Communities that settled here often went decades without seeing outsiders. Martin found land near a creek that locals had named Troublesome, and he had no idea how prophetic that name would become. He needed a wife, and in that isolated valley, options were limited. He married Elizabeth Smith, a red-haired woman from a nearby settlement. She seemed healthy, normal, beautiful even, but Elizabeth carried something in her blood. Something invisible, something that would curse their descendants for the next 2 centuries. They had 7 children. 4 of them were born blue. Imagine being a mother in 1820, holding your newborn baby, and watching in horror as its skin turns the color of midnight sky. No doctors, no hospitals, no explanations, just you, your husband, and a child whose skin was bright blue. The Fugate children grew up healthy otherwise. They played, they worked, they lived normal lives, but their skin remained an unnatural shade of indigo, blue, like someone had drained all the red from their blood and replaced it with ink. The neighbors whispered. Some called it a curse. Others believed it was God's punishment. A few thought the Fugates had made a deal with something unholy in those dark mountain hollows. But Martin and Elizabeth kept their children hidden. And as those children grew up, the geographic isolation created a terrible problem. Who could they marry? The nearest town was a day's journey on horseback through treacherous mountain paths. Outsiders rarely came to Troublesome Creek, and when they did, they took one look at the blue-skinned Fugates and fled. So the children did what their parents had done. They married within the valley. They married their neighbors. They married their cousins. And the blue bloodline spread like poison through the family tree. By 1850, 3 generations of Fugates had been born in Troublesome Creek, and the pattern was becoming undeniable. The more they married each other, the more blue children appeared. Let me explain what was happening in their blood, because it's both scientifically fascinating and absolutely horrifying. Elizabeth Smith, Martin's wife, carried a rare recessive gene for a condition called methemoglobinemia. It causes an abnormally high level of methemoglobin in the blood, a form of hemoglobin that can't carry oxygen properly. In normal people, methemoglobin makes up less than 1% of blood. In the Fugates, it was nearly 20%. Here's where it gets dark. For a child to be born blue, both parents must carry this recessive gene. In the general population, the odds of 2 carriers meeting and having children is astronomically low, maybe 1 in several million. But in an isolated community where cousins marry cousins, where the same bloodlines cross and recross for generations, the odds become almost certain by the 1880s. The Fugate family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled web. Brothers married sisters. In-law. First cousins married each other. Families intermarried so many times that children had the same surnames appearing 4 or 5 times in their ancestry. And with each generation, the blue grew darker. There were reports of children born so blue they were almost purple, of teenagers whose lips were indigo, of adults whose fingernails looked like they'd been dipped in ink. The Fugates became prisoners of their own bloodline. For over 100 years, Troublesome Creek kept its secret. The Fugates rarely left their hollow. They built their homes deep in the mountains, accessible only by narrow paths that outsiders wouldn't dare travel. They traded with a select few families who had grown accustomed to their appearance. But isolation breeds more than just genetic disorders. The community developed its own culture, its own rules, and according to elderly residents interviewed in the 1960s, its own dark traditions. Marriage wasn't about love in Troublesome Creek. It was about survival, about keeping the land within the family, about maintaining control over the few resources they had. Young people were discouraged from leaving. Stories spread about the dangers of the outside world, how outsiders would fear them, mock them, or worse. One elderly woman, interviewed decades later, recalled, "My mama told me I couldn't marry anyone from outside the creek, said our blood wouldn't mix right, said it was God's plan for us to stay together." God's plan? Or a prison disguised as tradition. By the early 1900s, nearly every family in Troublesome Creek had some connection to the Fugate bloodline. The blue skin became normalized. Children grew up thinking it was natural, but nature was keeping score. Infant mortality was high. Miscarriages were common. Some children were born with more than just blue skin. There were whispers of other abnormalities, other genetic problems that the families kept even more hidden than the blue. The price of keeping it in the family was being paid in blood. For 140 years, the blue Fugates lived in the shadows of Appalachia. But in 1960, everything changed. A young woman named Luna Fugate walked into a clinic in Lexington, Kentucky. She was there for a routine checkup, nothing unusual, but when she walked through the door, nurses gasped. Doctors stopped mid-sentence. Luna's skin was blue, not pale, not sickly, bright, vivid blue. One nurse later recalled, "I thought she was dying. I thought she'd been oxygen deprived for hours, but she was just standing there, smiling, completely healthy." The doctors had never seen anything like it. They ran blood tests. The results were baffling. Her blood was dark purple, almost maroon. When exposed to air, it barely turned red at all. Luna explained, very calmly, that she'd been blue her entire life. Her father was blue. Her grandmother was blue. Her cousins were blue. "We're just Fugates," she said, as if that explained everything. The doctors were horrified, not just by the blue skin, but by what Luna revealed next, her family tree. Dr. Madison Cowan Roman, 3, a young hematologist, took on Luna's case. He started investigating the Fugate family history, and what he discovered was one of the most extreme cases of isolated inbreeding in American medical history. The family tree showed first cousins marrying first cousins, repeatedly uncles marrying nieces, the same surnames appearing on both sides of every marriage, 6 consecutive generations of intermarriage with almost no outside blood doctor. Cowan later wrote, "It was astounding. The family had created their own genetic bottleneck. They were, for all practical purposes, a separate breeding population. The blue skin was just the visible symptom. The real damage was hidden in their DNA, recessive genes multiplying, genetic diversity vanishing, mutations accumulating generation after generation. But here's what made it even more disturbing. They knew. The older Fugates knew exactly what they were doing. They'd seen the pattern. They'd buried the children who didn't survive. They'd watched their bloodline grow darker and stranger, and they called it tradition. Dr. Cowan was determined to help the Fugates. He researched methemoglobinemia extensively and discovered something remarkable. The condition could be treated. A simple injection of methylene blue, a common dye, could temporarily convert methemoglobin back to normal hemoglobin. The blue skin would fade to pink within minutes. In 1960, Dr. Cowan returned to Troublesome Creek with his treatment. He gathered the blue Fugates and gave them injections. Patrick Fugate, a blue man in his 40s, was the first. Within 20 minutes of the injection, his skin began to change. The blue faded from his lips. His fingers turned pink. For the first time in his life, Patrick Fugate looked normal. His wife started crying. His children stared in disbelief. But then Patrick said something that haunted Dr. Cowan for the rest of his life. "I don't know who I am anymore." You see, the Fugates' identity was built around their condition. Being blue wasn't just a medical issue, it was who they were. It's what bound them together. It's what kept them isolated and, paradoxically, kept them united. Some Fugates took the treatment regularly. Others refused it entirely. Benjamin Fugate, one of the bluest members of the family, declined the injection. When asked why, he said, "This is how God made me. This is how my family has always been. Why would I want to be different?" But Dr. Cowan's work had another effect. It brought attention to Troublesome Creek. Newspapers ran stories about the blue people of Kentucky. Medical journals published case studies. Anthropologists became interested in the isolated community. And for the first time in 140 years, the outside world was looking in. Roads were built into the mountains. Electricity arrived. Television brought images of the wider world. Young Fugates left for college and jobs in cities. And slowly, the bloodline began to diversify. As Fugates married outsiders, the recessive genes were diluted. Children were born with normal skin tone. The blue began to fade from the family tree. By the 1980s, the last strongly blue Fugate had died. The condition still exists in the family, the recessive gene is still there, but it's no longer dominant. The blue people of Troublesome Creek have disappeared, but their story remains. So what do we make of the Fugates' story? On one hand, it's easy to judge, to look back and ask, why didn't they leave? Why didn't they marry outsiders? Why did they trap themselves in this genetic nightmare? But the truth is more complicated. The Fugates were products of their environment. Geographic isolation, poverty, lack of education, cultural norms that emphasized family loyalty above all else, these weren't choices. They were circumstances. And yet, there's a darker layer to this story. Because by the 20th century, the older Fugates did know what was happening. They understood the pattern. And they still discouraged their children from leaving, still arranged marriages within the family, still perpetuated the cycle. Why? Control, property, tradition, fear of the outside world, maybe even pride, a twisted sense that their bloodline was special, set apart, chosen. The Fugates aren't alone in this. Throughout history, isolated communities have fallen into the same trap. From remote valleys in Switzerland to islands in the Pacific, the pattern repeats. Isolation leads to intermarriage. Intermarriage leads to genetic problems. Genetic problems are normalized as family traits. And tradition becomes a prison that no one can escape. The Fugates' blue skin was a warning sign written in genetics that something was deeply wrong. But they called it tradition. They called it loyalty. They called it God's will. And for 140 years, children were born blue because of it. Today, Troublesome Creek is like any other rural Kentucky community. The Fugate descendants live normal lives. Most carry the recessive gene, but with genetic diversity restored, blue children are no longer born. The story has become local legend, sometimes told with humor, sometimes with shame, but the medical records remain. The family trees are documented. The photographs exist. The blue people of Troublesome Creek were real. And their story serves as a haunting reminder. that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones we build ourselves, stone by stone, generation by generation, and call it tradition. If this story disturbed you, fascinated you, or made you think differently about the word tradition, leave a comment below. Have you heard of other isolated communities with dark secrets? Share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that history tried to bury. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and remember, question everything, especially the things people say have always been this way. Because sometimes tradition is just another word for a trap.